Today I have Scott Hunter. He's the Vice President of Azure Developer Experience. He's been on before, but it's been a while, and I'm really excited to have him back. Scott, how are you?
I'm doing really well. Jesse, how are you doing?
I am doing great, but I want to ask you about your title, Vice President of Azure Developer Experience. Tell me what that entails.
Yeah, well, let me just tell you a little bit about my Microsoft history. So I just celebrated my 18th anniversary at Microsoft back in August.
Wow,
Um,
congratulations.
it feels like I can't imagine it's been 18 years. Doesn't feel like it's been that long, but it's been that long. I joined the ASP.NET team when I first joined Microsoft back in 2007, and while I was on that team, we built MVC, SignalR. We started, something you use all the time in your daily work. ASP.NET Web API and ASP.NET Web Pages, a variety of technologies. And then Scott Guthrie, who was he was in DevDiv back then when I joined the company. He moved to Azure around 2011, and so in 2011 I moved to Azure with him. Anything in our group that was web related went with Scott to Azure. And so while we were in Azure, we open sourced all of ASP.NET. And we worked on all the web tooling to make it really easy to publish to Azure. Right-click publish in Visual Studio. I know people say don't use it, but back then it took an hour and a half to publish an app to Azure, and our goal was to get it down to like a minute. But while we were doing that Azure journey, we built a bunch of services, things like App Service, Azure Functions. We bought a company called Epiphany, which is now API management. There was a Redis cache. We had a cache back then that was proprietary. We switched to Redis cache, open source. And so I worked on a bunch of services. But my favorite part of my Microsoft career was probably around 2014. We showed the first prototype of ASP.NET Core. We called it ASP.NET 5 back then, but it was literally for .NET to move forward, it's got to be small, fast, cross-platform, open source. And so we started this open source journey with .NET. And the very first version of that ran on Mono because at the time we didn't have a core CLR that we could run cross-plat on. And I remember talking to Julia Lucen. She was the CVP that ran DevDiv. And she came to me in 2014 and said, Scott, I'm going to give you a core CLR that'll let you run cross-platform. But also I'd really like you to come back to DevDiv and do this, this .NET Core journey in DevDiv where .NET is. And so I came back to DevDiv in 2016 and we shipped the first version of .NET Core that year. Over the next couple of years, we shipped a variety of versions that, in .NET world, I would tell you the first two versions were kind of wobbly, but by version 3, we really had it down. It was super fast, super easy to use, ran great on all the platforms. I'm talking to you on a Mac today, and I use .NET on my Mac every day. But a weird thing happens at Microsoft. All those services that we worked on when I was in Azure came back to DevDiv. When they came back to DevDiv, they asked me to go work on those things again because I had experience with them. And so that's where my title comes from. So what my team actually builds today is I build the PaaS platform. That's things like Azure Container Apps, Azure App Service, Azure Functions. We build API management, Redis cache, and a couple other. But my roots have always been a developer, and so my team also is responsible for all the Visual Studio and Visual Studio Code extensions for Azure. So we build all the developer-y kind of things that you might use. And there's some new stuff that we should talk about on this podcast today. My team builds the Azure MCP. That's how CoPilot or any LLM can talk to and use and do actions for you inside of Azure across various services. We also build all the SDKs for Azure. And then I've got what I call a platform team that builds some of the actual underlying platformy stuff, like if you want config or you want dashboards with Grafana or logic apps or other stuff. And so I'm kind of a mix of stuff is what I would tell you. We just got reorged a few weeks ago, and now our team is part of this another part of Azure. Kind of joined my team. It's the AI Foundry, and so if you're building agents in the future, it's AI Foundry, and so I think it's great. What I always tell people, it's great to have the developer tools along with the services being close together.
Yes.
The closer they are together, the better they're going to work together, because we're all day trying to use these things and make them work. So, but I still stay involved with the .NET folks because I most of my career, 2/3 of my career is spent on the .NET side. So, but that's
Well, probably 90% of what I'm doing day to day is stuff from your group,
you're
from the sound of it.
using my Azure stuff as well, or just doing the .NET stuff?
Yes, yes, we use Azure Fine. We use durable functions.
Yes, awesome.
Yeah, I should probably pitch my book on .NET API with C Sharp.
You
And
should.
there's a couple chapters in there, not written by me, but by my co-writer, co-author, who he wrote beautiful chapters on Azure functions and durable functions. And every once in a while, I go back and reread it because it, for me, it's like the international dateline. When you explain it to me, I get it, but then an hour later, it's gone from my head.
I think the hardest one there is to Azure Functions is not too hard to understand in my opinion. Azure Functions, for folks that are listening, it's basically a mechanism for hosting APIs in Azure, and they're what we call serverless, which means they only run when they're actually being invoked. And so the idea is you save money because you don't have a virtual machine running 24/7 hosting your API. Basically, a request comes in, we boot up your API, we call it, and then we put all the infrastructure back away. Functions also has the ability to have uh, what's the word for it? Bindings, and these bindings let you say, hey, if somebody drops a text file into a blob storage, I want to be notified of that. And so
So
your code wakes up.
triggers.
Hmm?
We're talking about triggers, right?
Yes, we're talking about triggers.
Okay.
And your code wakes up and can do some actions and go away. And that's a lot better than having your code writing some polling code to go poll the storage and look at it every 10 seconds. Once again, we're trying to be serverless, which means we only want you to run while the code is actually going. And durable adds a totally different flavor to it. In some ways, durable makes your it's like a state machine. So in the case
Mhm.
of if you're doing a durable function, I could say in my code, I'll give you a crazy example. I could write a durable function that emails a customer 30 days after they've joined my site. Hey, I just want to send you an email letting you know, asking how it's going. Are you enjoying the site, et cetera, et cetera. It can do that because in my durable function, I could literally say sleep for a month.
Mhm.
And it's going to go not run for 30 days. And then it's going to wake up at 30 days and go send the email and then go back to sleep. And so, it's stateful. And you can do very long running tasks. And once again, you're only being charged while we're actually running your code again. So that during that 30 days, you're not paying the bill for the sitting idle, waiting for the next thing to trigger it to wake up again.
Yes. Yes. Huge advantage. Can you talk a little bit about scaling functions and durable functions?
Well, scaling is interesting because we just released a new version of functions last year. So one of the negatives of functions historically has been we didn't scale super fast. So if you wanted to be very bursty, like for example, let's say your function's sitting there and it's getting a request every minute or so, and then some major event occurs, like maybe it's Christmas time shopping and it's processing orders, and suddenly we're in the Black Friday time zone, and getting a couple of requests a minute turns into 10,000 a minute. We released a new SKU of functions, which will become the primary SKU of functions over time, and we call that flex consumption functions. And so Flex has uses some new infrastructure that we built in Azure, and we can basically scale you from one instance to 1,000 instances in just seconds. Some of the demos that we've done, Paul Yuknovich on my team and I have done. we've actually sat there and we're showing the monitoring inside of Azure, and we just pour a bunch of traffic on this thing, and it goes from like one instance to 10,000 instances in just under a minute. And
Wow.
then as the traffic slows down, it scales all the way back down. So once again, you pay for the burst, but you're not paying for the fact that at some point you had 10,000 virtual machines running,
Okay.
doing that. And it used to take us seconds to boot up each of those virtual machines, and now we can boot them up just instantaneously. And so our primary competitor in this space is Amazon Lambda, or AWS Lambda, and we actually scale faster than Lambda does now, which I'm super excited about. This is a 2 or 3 year effort that we would come in and report to our bosses and show our attempts to get this thing to scale super fast. And the idea there is, for us too, we don't want to have some huge pool of 100,000 virtual machines that we have to pay for, so we can scale you fast like that. So we just had to make some really cool tech that could really scale these instances up and down very, very fast. And so team is super proud about it. And as I said, over time, that'll be the only SKU of functions that we'll have left. We did some other cool stuff. I don't know if you saw this, but in the old days when you wrote a function, especially in .NET, you had to use function programming APIs, and so it meant that your code didn't look exactly like it would have looked as an ASP.NET Web API. And we've done a lot of work the last couple of years too to make make it where you can almost just paste a Web API directly into a function and have it behave the same way. Or if you're using the newer .NET Core style function APIs, the minimal APIs, we've got great support for that now too.
This isn't where I intended to go, and I do want to get to Visual Studio, a couple of other things. But before I lose this thread, if folks want to get comfortable with Azure DevOps, which I believe encompasses some of what you're talking about, first of all, is that right? And secondly, where would be a good place to go to get started to bootstrap yourself on this?
So, I mean, when you say of Azure DevOps, I think of in the DevOps space, we have 2 offerings at Microsoft. We have Azure DevOps, that's the CI/CD pipelines and code stuff, source control, and we have GitHub. And so, we would recommend most customers, if you're doing new stuff, do it in GitHub. If you already have existing, pipelines, do them in Azure DevOps. Like I'll be very brutally honest. Things like Visual Studio, things like .NET, they're all built on Azure DevOps. We store the source code in GitHub because we did that because as we open source these products, especially the .NET product, GitHub is kind of where it's the capital of all open source, and so that was an important thing for us even all the way back in 2014. I remember asking Brian Harry, who ran that group at the time. I'm like, hey, Brian, I'm doing this .NET open source thing, and I really need to put it in GitHub because we didn't own GitHub back then. And he got us into GitHub. Let us put .NET into GitHub, which has been great because we've had tens of thousands of pull requests from our customers. Many of the bugs. And many of the performance improvements as well didn't come from Microsoft. They also came from our customers. And so .NET is not only a great Microsoft product, but it's also been a very well accepted open source product with tons and tons of submissions from our customers. But both of those products are what we would recommend of how you actually publish your app to Azure. I mentioned before I built the right-click publish tech a long time ago. But in the modern world, we prefer you to build a GitHub action or an Azure DevOps pipeline, that's CI/CD, to publish your apps. And I tell almost all customers, if you're building containers, especially, you must have CI/CD because when a container is actually stateless, or I'm not using the right word. It is once you make it, you can't change it. So basically, we stamp an OS, we stamp a .NET, we stamp a version of your app into that thing, and in the world of like Linux, especially, a Linux distro is probably out of date within a day or two, and so you need a CI/CD pipeline so you can be continually deploying an application with the latest version of the OS and so on. But that's kind of how those things correspond um, with functions.
Now, watch this segue. Having talked about performance in Azure, I'm going to segue right into Visual Studio 2026, where performance, from my perspective, is the first huge improvement. But tell me, I mean, and you mentioned before we started recording, and I think you're absolutely right, that the use of AI in Visual Studio 2026 Copilot and related is right up there with a major improvement in Visual Studio 2026. Let's talk about that from your perspective, from the OS perspective, and the building of Visual. Was your group? Did I understand was involved in the building of Visual Studio 2026?
I don't build Visual Studio 2026, but I build some of the really cool extensions that plug into Visual Studio 2026, and I can talk about that.
Yes, please.
And there's a couple of great examples that we should talk about. This we didn't even talk about in our figuring out what we should talk about today. First off, let me hit a couple things. I'll hit the thing that's not from my team, but as I said, I worked in .NET for 2/3 of my career. Actually, I worked on the .NET team, I should say. I still use .NET every day. One of the things that's most exciting to me is, as a customer, whenever we ship a new version of .NET, your company has to adopt a new version of Visual Studio. And so one of the other capabilities in Visual Studio 2026 is it's the first time that we've decoupled the language platforms from Visual Studio. And what I mean by that is when a .NET 11 comes, you wouldn't have to go upgrade to Visual Studio 2027 to use it, or you wouldn't have to go install a patch version of Visual Studio 2026 to use it, because that decoupling, now I can just install a brand new .NET SDK. Visual Studio can go, oh, I see that, I know how to use it, and you don't have to upgrade your Visual Studio. And you might ask, for me, that doesn't matter because I'm a bleeding edge person. I've got a preview version of Windows on my Windows machine. I've got Visual Studio 2026. I'm running all the new stuff. But many of our customers do have requirements where they have to stay on an LTS version of .NET.
Right.
And so if a Visual Studio brings a new non-LTS version of .NET, they might not be allowed to use that new Visual Studio in their organization. And so that coupling hurts companies that have policies that don't allow a .NET 9 to be on the box, for example. And so that decoupling is super important. And the decoupling also this helps prevent bugs. The tighter coupled these things are, the more likely they're to break if one side's wrong. And it's like, oh, now you've got to upgrade your .NET to make Visual Studio work again, or you got to upgrade your Visual Studio to make .NET work again. So any decoupling we can do there is super important. The CoPilot stuff and the AI stuff, there's two places that I interact with Visual Studio. Number one is, as I said before, I work in the Azure space, and talk about the evolution of CoPilot. Like 2 years ago, when CoPilot first came out, it was primarily a tool that you could ask questions. Like, how would I write a bubble sort in .NET?
Mm-hmm.
And in the chat window, it would spit out some code, and if you wanted to, you could copy that code and paste it in. How would I turn on SSL in ASP.NET Core? You can ask, you could ask those types of questions. And so, in many ways, I thought of that as like smart docs.
Okay.
In the past, we would always have a browser window open in the Microsoft Docs, and you would kind of search around from there. I don't really have to search as much anymore. I can just kind of ask the question, and I get the answer right in the CoPilot. But CoPilot really, really started changing when we moved to a new version or a new style of CoPilot, where CoPilot could actually put stuff in the actual editor for you. And so this is what I would call the agent mode. And agent mode is something we shipped early this year. It's in Visual Studio 2026. It's available in the existing Visual Studio as well, and VS Code. And Here's my canonical example that I show agent mode when I show agent mode to customers. I bring a Visual Studio up and I've got a Blazor application running, and I'm like, I go to the agent and I say, hey, can you change the button on all my web pages to be orange and round?
Yes.
And so the agent mode is the version of CoPilot that doesn't just look at the single file you're in or the code that you pasted in the window. It can look at your entire project. Um, and so it'll actually go and say, hey, I found out this is a Blazor project. I found the CSS file. I'm going to add some new styles to the CSS. I'm going to go to the Razor page that actually has the button in it. I'm going to update the style. And all of that happens in just, I don't know, 30 seconds. And that's amazing. This is very different than vibe coding. Vibe coding is the idea of just sitting with nothing and building from scratch. But this agent mode stuff is super useful for doing this kind of work. It's just a few weeks ago, I was working on an MCP, and I'll explain what MCPs are in a second. And the functions team has a new feature that they're going to ship soon as well, which is you can host any MCP in Azure Functions, but it had a requirement that the MCPs normally write out to the console, and then the LLM looks at the console output and does stuff with it. But the functions implementation of MCP requires your MCP to be streamable. And so, once again, I'm like, okay, well, my default MCP is just using console output. I need to switch this to a web app and turn on the MCP support in ASP.NET Core. And so I make that change, and then I want to make sure I can still run it locally. The function support requires it to be on a particular port. And so I'm like, okay, I would have wrote the code to go look up if does this environment variable exist? If it does, boot up ASP.NET Core on this environment variable, else use the default config. I just go into agent mode and say, hey, I want my application to check if this environment variable exists. If it does, I want it to use it. If not, use the default config that's in local settings. And it wrote the exact same code I would have written in .NET myself. Now, in this case, I didn't go off and vibe code anything at all. I knew exactly what I wanted. And because I asked for exactly what I wanted, the AI wrote the code almost exactly as I would want to do that. And so this tech is firmly integrated into Visual Studio 2026. And it's also available in the existing versions of Visual Studio today if you're on the latest versions. Another aspect of this that I think is even cooler is as you start doing this kind of work, there's one negative, which is if I'm in the chat window, I'm synchronous. I can only ask for one thing at a time. Yes. And because basically I have to wait for the chat to finish. And so something else that we just introduced at Build this year is the coding agent. And so in the coding agent, what we've done is we've taken that same CoPilot that exists inside of Visual Studio 2026, and we've made it exist inside of GitHub. And so this means I could, instead of doing what I just described before, I could go to GitHub, file an issue, hey, change all the buttons in this application to be orange and round. And then I could assign that issue to the coding agent. And then in the cloud, the coding agent's going to go and look at my repo and do the same thing it was going to do in Visual Studio in that chat for us. And so our teams at Microsoft, and including the .NET team, are now taking certain bugs and assigning them to the coding agent and having the coding agent do the work. The cool thing is it's not, it doesn't go change the code base. It's just going to file a PR. And then a senior engineer at Microsoft has to approve that PR. So they're going to go approve that PR the same way they would approve a PR, if a junior developer at Microsoft went and fixed one of those bugs. And so I think it's going to fundamentally change the way that we think and write code. We've learned ourselves in early experiments, we weren't getting good results. It's because the issues of the bugs that we had weren't very clear. And so we know if the more information you put about being very descriptive, like let's say you're a junior dev and you fix a bug. I'm the senior dev. I look at your bug and I'm like, I don't like the way that Jesse fixed this. I would probably come talk to you, Jesse. You should have done this and this and this. And so what we kind of learn is if you actually make the bug detailed with that level of information, then the coding agent can actually fix that for you. But let's talk about what I do. There's two things that I do in this space. One of these is what we call MCPs. And so if you don't know what MCP is in LLMs, MCP stands for Model Context Protocol, and it's funny because it's a cheesy AP. It was, I believe, it was written by Anthropic. These people that make Claude and Sonnet. These are models that you might use for coding. I think it was an intern project like months and months ago. But the magic of an MCP is it enables the AI to actually do something on your behalf. And so what we've done at Microsoft is we've gone and built a bunch of MCPs around all the services that exist in Azure. We built MCPs for GitHub. So what an MCP for GitHub means here, what it means is I can now go to agent mode and say, file a bug on Jesse Liberty that says, I don't really like the way this function works. I would prefer it to do X, Y, and Z. I didn't have to go to github.com and file an issue. I didn't have to go to Visual Studio and file an issue. I can do it right from the chat. So with the MCP enabled, what that means is the GitHub MCP, the LLM can take the context of what I said. It'll go to the MCP. The MCP will have a function in it that says file an issue, and the AI will call the file an issue feature in the MCP and pass the right parameters into it, which then puts the issue into GitHub.
Yeah,
I don't know if you've used this stuff yet, Jesse, or not, but if you have not, you should start trying this stuff. It is amazing. So where this gets really cool in the .NET world, like you were telling me earlier, you're on .NET 9.
that's right.
In November at .NET Conf, we're going to ship .NET 10. So there's two really cool extensions to Visual Studio that we built. One is the .NET Upgrade Assistant. There's a classic version of this where there was an extension you would install and it brought up a UI, but now we've AI-ified this. So what you'll be able to do on November, whatever date in November .NET Conf is going to be this year, you'll be able to go into the agent mode and say, upgrade my .NET 9 application to .NET 10. And that's going to invoke technically an MCP that we wrote that kicks off an agentic upgrade process. And it will take your .NET 9 project and convert it to .NET 10 for you without you having to do the manual steps to do that. It's going to go into your CS proj. It's going to make those updates. It's going to make the NuGet package updates, the match to the new stuff. It'll potentially make coding changes if there's stuff that we removed or it's no longer supported, and so on. And so we've .NET Upgrade tool is something that my team and the .NET team work on together. And then there's an even cooler tool. We call this app modernization tool. And what the app modernization tool does is it can do things to get your app ready to go to like Azure. So for example, if you're using connection strings in your application, when you move to Azure, you really should be using something like Key Vault. You can basically tell it, change my connection strings to use Key Vault, and it will go do all that work for you and make the code changes for you to do that.
That's great. Having done that by hand, that's great.
I have done that by hand for my entire career. And we already have teams in Microsoft. A variety of teams at Microsoft use .NET, obviously. And they use .NET because it's super high performance, and they want to be on the latest versions all the time. Because if we make it 10% faster, well, that means their cost might lower by 10%. And at the scale of some of the things in Microsoft, 10% could be 10 million or 100 million or more.
Rounding errors.
Yeah, we recently had a team. It's the team that works in the back end of the Teams app, actually. And they moved from one version of .NET to another version of .NET. They did it in an hour. It would only take them a week to do something like that using these agentic tools. So I'm building the agentic app mod tools and the upgrade tools.
One of the things I want to make sure, because you've mentioned a number of things and things that people are going to want to try and do. So, what I'm hoping is we can put in the show notes some links to where they can learn, where they can find places that'll say step by step, let me walk you through
Yes.
creating this and using this and so forward.
While we're talking performance, I put a link in the chat already for you. That is Stephen Tobe does a blog post. If you don't know Stephen Tobe, folks, he is a partner engineer on the .NET team that works on all parts of .NET, but he writes these mega blog posts that are like probably 50, 60, 100, maybe 200 pages of content that shows the performance improvements that go into each version of .NET. We just released the new blog post on that for .NET 10. It's in the chat.
Yes, I have it.
Let me get you a link to the .NET upgrade tools. And by the way, the .NET the newer .NET tool that we just built can also move you from framework to core as well. So it can do that for any of the app types that make sense: WinForms, WPF, MVC, Web API, web pages. Those can all be moved. The tool will help you move those types of applications from .NET Framework.
A little bit ago, you said if you haven't tried this, you must, and that's one I want to get a link to of how you go about trying that feature.
Here we go. And it is in the chat now too, sir.
Okay, the other thing that I want to talk about before I let you go is performance. As a user, as soon as I installed 2026, the first thing I noticed, I was blown away by the performance improvement. And I want to ask you one thing. A couple years ago, I went out because I was frustrated with the cycle of write code, build code, test code, write code, et cetera, and how long things were taking. So I went out and I got a
We call that, our term for that in Microsoft is we call that the inner loop.
yeah, right. I went out and bought a 64 gig machine and multiple. I don't remember how many core, and it made some improvement, but not a dramatic one. Now it seems like Visual Studio is taking advantage of all of that and is blazingly fast. Now, am I interpreting that correctly?
I can't personally answer that. I don't know why this version of .NET would take more advantage, or this version of Visual Studio would take more advantage of your RAM than the previous versions. I can ask and send you offline what changes were made that might cause you to see that kind of change in performance. It's complicated. All up, we've done so many things over the years with Visual Studio. It used to be Visual Studio was a monolithic application.
Mm-hmm.
Unknown to you, if you actually go look, there's a whole bunch of processes. So we've been breaking Visual Studio into pieces, and the idea was back in the day that we were using 32-bit memory, so we wouldn't hit the 32-bit 4 gig limit. We started spawning off more side processes because each process can have use the full amount of memory on the machine. But I'd have to ask the team what we did to cause it to feel like it's, is the editor better? Is the compile speed better? What actually are you seeing, Jesse, that's the best part that you feel it's using your memory better?
Two things. It's loading much faster, which I know you separated out the UI and multitask that. And then the other is the build process is just lightning. Especially the rebuild is incredibly fast. And it's such a pleasure.
Let me check with the team offline. It could just be that what you're seeing compiler improvements as well. So I will tell you, when I was in the .NET team and we were working on the .NET cores, it was around the release that we shipped the first versions of Hot Reload,
Mm-hmm.
and we did all kinds of perf benchmarking. And you would be surprised that just doing a build, in some cases there'd be when you go and do a build. When it goes and figures out what changed, that process might take 8 seconds. And so we sped up a bunch of that stuff back. I want to say this was around .NET 6 timeframe. But they've been steadily working to improve that. So in many cases, this stuff just comes down to our own tools doing too much work and that work hitting you right in the face. I remember my favorite version of this was when we were building the first version of ASP.NET Core. Um, if you've been using ASP.NET for a long time, and you're using MVC, it's got these controllers, and we have to have some code to go find all the controllers. And so what would happen is when your ASP.NET project boots up, we would go use reflection to go find all the controllers inside of the process. What we learned during the .NET Core timeframe, the very initial versions of .NET Core, was we didn't do that once. We did it like 10 times. And so when we did the core bits, we cut out all the other times that happened, and it only happens once.
Right.
And so that's just an example of the types of optimizations that we find over time. And that's why ASP.NET Core is so much faster than ASP.NET Web Forms, is because we identified all these times where we're just doing so much pre-work and duplicating pre-work. And so I know in the case of MS Build, in the case of, there was lots of that slop was still left even after we did the .NET 6 release. And so I would not be surprised if what you're also seeing is that between 7, 8, 9, 10, they've done more work there too.
Yes.
Other crazy things that we did over time when we were working on things like hot reload. If you're in Visual Studio, we can cheat. So, you're in Visual Studio, you're writing code. Let's say your app's running, you want to go change some code. Well, as you change the code, the IntelliSense compiler is technically compiling the code on the fly. So we would do tricks like, if you say you want to save that, which means the hot reload is going to happen, we don't compile the code again. We just take the code we compiled from IntelliSense and push that into the process. So there's all kinds of, that's an example of a trick that we do. And so I'm going to guess they've done a whole bunch more of those types of tricks to make the perf a lot better. But I will ask and let you know offline what I find.
I appreciate that. This is fantastic. I wanted to ask you about Aspire, but we've been into a whole lot of topics. So this is going to be my trick to get you to come back.
Yeah,
And
I'd love to come back and talk about Aspire. I'm a big fan of Aspire, and I don't think enough .NET people use Aspire. What I'll tell you is, I think there's this belief in the .NET community that Aspire means you've got to start from new. And you can take any MVC project, any Web API project, any .NET project, and Aspirify it and get all the benefits of Aspire without starting from scratch. And so I'd love to come back and talk about that and how, I think everybody should be using Aspire for many reasons: for local run, for dashboarding, for telemetry, and for cloud publishing. But I really want to tell people, don't feel like you have to go, Aspire means I start over. No, your existing apps can run in Aspire today with almost no code change at all. And I'd like to come back and, especially if we can share screens, I'd like to do a demo and show that kind of stuff.
oh, absolutely. Let's do that.
Okay.
I will. I'll try to get on your calendar, which that should get us by, let's see, 2027, somewhere in there.
You know my ad, man. It's not that hard.
No, it's not. And you've been very kind and patient, and I know that I missed an appointment certainly, and so I'm really appreciative of you coming on and you're taking us through all of this. This has been absolutely fantastic.
Glad to be here, and happy to come back soon.